wanted to start off with just maybe something to think about, and then we'll open it up to the floor for questions. I wanted to start this out by having you consider the idea of, we heard from kind of the policy angle, we heard about individual behaviors and actions, and I'm wondering a little bit about this intersection between them and how individuals can actually have an impact if policy is one method to do that. But if any of you could think a little bit about where is that intersection? Greg, you should come up here too.
Greg, come join us. I'll give you an example where I think a good example of where it has happened for us here in Wisconsin, and I think that's recycling. So recycling is a case where it started, and much through the schools, of children talking to their families about individual practices, and those practices build, and we have a really strong statewide recycling program now that when there are discussions about reducing that program really across the continuum, we've come to a place where we think that recycling is a norm, and this is something we should do. Sharon made the point that beliefs don't lead to actions. There's some evidence that actions lead to beliefs, that it's uncomfortable to be a recycler and think recycling is dumb. So over time I start to think recycling is brilliant, and because I do it. And that sort of is maybe the way, certainly we think that's a way to lead to the policy thing, that if we can create communities of people who believe they're part of a climate change solution, they'll agitate and support for a bigger climate change solution.
I recently attended a conference on this topic, and several speakers were quite clear about the fact that they thought that individual behavior change will not be sufficient to solve the problem. We do need policy change. So then the question always comes, well, is it really worth it to work on these individual behaviors? But very much like Kathy, I think there's a causal chain. It could be that changing behaviors is the first step. That will then also help changing beliefs. And changing beliefs, that will, by the end, change policy. I mean, our politicians we vote them and they want to get reelected, so they will do the policies that they think that the majority of the people who vote for them support. So if a lot of people have very favorable beliefs and attitudes and behaviors with regard to the environment, then when the policy changes will occur.
Yeah, just 2 points on top of that is, I think one, when we're talking about policies and things that need to change for climate change, I think it's important to think that we're talking about not whether 10 or 15 coal plants get built or not. It's really the millions of decisions that get made about what people buy, what people do, and probably the billions of decisions of the smaller decisions each day when we're talking about behavior. So that's one thing, is to think about lots of small decisions, not just a few big ones. And second, maybe more directly to answer your question, I think people in policy design and policy analysis now are looking at ways that you can use social norms and some of the phenomena you guys are talking about as a way to make policies more effective. So you can design a good policy, but for a variety of reasons it won't work. But if you design it in a smart way, use communications in a good way, you can get these network effects and things kind of snowball where you can actually make things work better. So I don't think of them as kind of separate. They're actually nice ways of working together these days.
I think the Cadillac issue for, if you want an example of bottom-up change, is climate change. If you look at our country in particular, there's so little going on at a national level, sometimes even a regional level, and yet the ferment at local levels is incredible. And I think, I agree with all the colleagues who've spoken already, that the more people at a local level model beliefs and behaviors, the more those things build. And sooner or later, and I think again, one example of a cultural flip that we're experiencing right now, same-sex rights in this country, the sooner or later that accretion of people has an impact.
I think those are all really wonderful points, and just to add a sense that just as there is individual action that helps create political will for institutional change or policy change, sometimes policy change comes without that full, even large majority support. And so I think in those cases, it's interesting to see the examples of how change in behavior can actually change beliefs. And in my examples, I talked about how people may be adapting to climate change in very different ways according to different preferences and goals that they have. But if we can create a space to create more of a shared vision where that is possible, then that may open up the field for other changes, both at individual or at more societal levels.
Thanks. I'd like to open it up to the floor for questions now. We have a microphone that will be dashing around. Give us a moment. I see one in the back here. Kind of. Eleanor's on her way.
I'm a student here at UW-Madison, and while I think it's really important that individuals change their behavior, I think it's also really important that public policy is put into place that enforces that behavior. But I feel very strongly that at certain times in our country's politics, we get gridlocked by bipartisanship. I'm wondering if any of you could comment on how people in my generation could look forward to changing that mindset so that change can actually be put into action.
Yeah, that's an easy one.
I would note that Newt Gingrich appears to have changed his mind again.
I mean, if you're talking about your generation, it seems like within your generation, there's got to be less partisanship on this particular issue than in older generations. So, I mean, maybe the issue then is that you guys need to age faster or get into power faster. But I mean, it can only, your generation, it's not going to be a split like it is now.
Yeah. Thanks, Olivia, for that question. I think in some ways we've talked about or heard about polarization getting worse and maybe even exacerbated by siloed media sources that people are in their own little bubble. So I think one thing that we can all do is try to work harder to maintain bridges outside of our bubbles. And Madison is often accused of that, of living in our own world. And so I think bridging between the reality of people's lives here and the reality of people who might not agree with you can often really be illuminating and make you think of things you didn't think of before. So I think opportunities for students to bridge to other places off campus and to other cities and rural parts of the state and country, I think would be really great, and internationally. Yeah.
I think maybe your questions also is important with regard to that we should be thinking more about who is our target population. I mean, I do in a related thing research on prejudice and discrimination, and it's stunning that many of these interventions actually seem to be focusing either African Americans or white liberals who already have quite positive attitudes towards multiculturalism, but they never seem to be targeting people who actually have hostile or negative feelings towards minority or outgroups. So the question I'm asking, if it has to do with bipartisanship and polarization of political camps, shouldn't we think a little more about who our target population is and maybe stop preaching to those who are already convinced and actually target those who may need a little more help changing their behaviors?
Hi, I have a question about social media with behavior change. I read a study a few years ago, and I can't remember who did it, but it was about how social media has given the avenue, the microphone to people of the minority that before couldn't get anybody's attention, and maybe raising where we want to change behavior by positive influence and saying, 75% of the hotel guests reuse the towels. They are getting more and more avenues of saying climate change isn't real. And because they have this platform to reach thousands of people and internet memes get passed on faster and faster, how can you, I'm not suggesting that you tell us how to rebut that on your own personal Facebook page, but how do you handle the mass media or social media giving that avenue to folks that didn't really have it before and are quite a minority when it comes to the population.
Yeah, thank you. Every new medium that shows up on the premises produces a strong fear reaction in our culture. I don't remember this per se, but it's happened all along the way, from radio to comic books to television. And now what we see at this time is a real concern about the user control component of social media, that no longer does anyone have control over what people see. People can go out and rummage around on the internet and pick and choose. And that is true, but I think that what is accompanying that, and it's a slow process, is a cultural growing sophistication with these channels. An increased awareness, for example, that there are aberrant characters out there, that a particular site may not be all that it's cracked up to be. And as time goes by, you're seeing all of us getting more and more sophisticated about using these channels. That certainly doesn't prevent somebody who already strongly believes that climate change is a crock from privileging the sites that make that point again and again and again. But I think increasingly people are making judgments about sites, making judgments about tweets, and I think ultimately I have a great deal of faith in each of us and our ability to begin to sift and winnow.
Hi. This is a question for Dr. Greg Nemeth. You mentioned nuclear power in terms of helping, like France and Switzerland, to decarbonize their energy sources. So the question is, what is stopping people from building more nuclear power plants? And how do you feel about hydroelectrical power in terms of decarbonization?
Right, yeah, so nuclear power is almost completely carbon-free, and it doesn't have the intermittent aspects that renewables have, so it's really attractive. The problems with it is that if we had safe, cheap nuclear power, we'd be in really good shape. We'd have something that could handle a big chunk of the problem, not the whole problem, but a big chunk of it. So, safety's been an issue, but the expensive part right now has been a much bigger issue. I mean, we're shutting down nuclear power plants around the country, including in this state, not because it's too expensive to build them. They're already built, that's sunk costs. They're too expensive to run. So that's a big challenge for nuclear power now, is how do you compete with cheap natural gas? And in the long term, how do you compete with renewables and storage and things like that? So nuclear power is attractive, but it's got some serious problems. And right now, there's a few places that are building nuclear power, but not at the rate that places like France and Sweden did 20 or 30 years ago. Oh, and on hydroelectric, that's something where in this country we've kind of used up all the places. The big area that it could be interesting is to some extent Latin America, but really in Southeast Asia, where that could make a really big difference. There's a lot of untapped hydro potential there. So big impacts there, and even more diverse and controversial impacts than nuclear power, but low carbon.
One more? Yep, there's one in the back here.
I think all this is really great and fascinating, but I kind of feel like we're missing a piece of the puzzle, which is the fact that the American political process is currently dominated by special interests, and particularly people like the Koch brothers, who just have such phenomenal amounts of money. that, they're really driving a lot of the political process. So my question is, you're talking about behavioral change at the individual level and, creating this collective will for policy. But on the other hand, we've got these guys out there who just are so powerful, and they're doing things like paying people to go on the internet and, write stuff that's against climate change and swing public opinion in that way at the same time. So I don't know if this is a question that anybody can really answer, but I just wanted to put that out there as something to discuss. How do we at the individual grassroots level deal with people like that?
So I take a lot of hope from, and Sharon mentioned this earlier, the marriage equality shift in this country. I was at an environmental conference about 6 months ago where folks from Freedom to Marry talked about how they very deliberately made marriage equality a personal issue, that people shared stories with people they knew, so that a bigger portion of the population would say, oh yeah, I know someone who's gay, and they should have equal rights. And I think so we tend to think, okay, if we can have people say, but wait a minute, I do things that are sustainable and they make my life better. Why would I stop doing them? That there's a sort of equivalent thing there. I think 5 years ago, if folks would have said, well, we'll be by 2014 on the verge of marriage equality across the US, most pundits would have said it'll never happen that fast. There's magic to the grassroots part of this too, if it can be strategically mobilized. And part of our challenge is to think about how we do that on this issue that is so pressing to our future.
I mean, let's face it, 81% of the American public thinks that the globe is warming.
Right.
And so that's an important fundamental set of belief, I think, that can help activate long-term change, despite the Koch brothers.
Yeah, and just one additional point. I think it's to be expected that when you have a potentially really big set of policies like climate policy would be, that's going to create winners and losers, that those who anticipate being losers are going to react, especially if they're concentrated and have strong interests. And that's happened in the past. It's happened with tobacco legislation. It's happened with ozone in the 70s. And I think that what I take away from that is that in the longer term, the dispersed interest that would win from climate policy eventually won out. And hopefully it doesn't take that long. But if you look at the history of some of these other environmental problems, there's almost always pushback against them. And if you think about what we did on ozone in the 1970s, where the US was the first country to really start banning spray cans and things like that, there was big pushback, denial of the science, and we went to, within 5 years, not wanting to do anything on ozone. 5 years later, after the ozone hole, the US was championing an international regime that eventually got passed and eventually incorporated developing countries and almost completely phases out ozone depleting substances. So I think one lesson is that progress is unlikely to be steady and monotonic, that it's going to go in fits and starts and look like we're going backwards at times. And if you look historically, that's sometimes the pattern that we need to get where we need to go.
Thank you so much. We're out of time, but please join me in thanking our speakers.